Welcome to Party, April 29th, 2026. Today we're diving deep into a supply chain attack that's hitting close to home for a lot of developers, the Bitwarden CLI compromise. This isn't just another random NPM package getting backdoored. We're talking about the official Bitwarden command line interface, version 2026.4.0, getting injected with malicious code through a compromised CI/CD workflow. And here's the kicker. It's all tied to something called the Shai-Hulud worm and an ongoing campaign targeting Checkmarx. So if you're using the Bitwarden CLI or you're just interested in how these supply chain attacks are evolving, you're gonna want to stick around for this one. Let's start with what we actually know happened here. According to the socket research team, the compromised package is specifically Bitwarden and Listen version 2026.4.0, and the malicious code was embedded in a file called bw1.js. Now, this wasn't some external hacker breaking into Bitwarden systems. This was done through their own GitHub Actions workflow. The attackers essentially poisoned the CI/CD pipeline, which means they got the official build process to create and distribute a backdoored version. That's honestly pretty sophisticated when you think about it. What makes this particularly concerning is that we're not just talking about some random package here. Bitwarden is a password manager that developers trust with their most sensitive credentials. So when you compromise the CLI tool, you're potentially getting access to SSH keys, crypto wallet keys, and CI/CD secrets. Multiple headlines are framing this as targeting crypto wallet keys specifically, which makes sense if you're a developer using Bitwarden to store your crypto keys, and you're using the CLI to access them. That malicious code in bw1.js could potentially harvest those credentials. My take is, this shows how supply chain attackers are getting more strategic about targeting high-value tools in the developer ecosystem. Now here's where it gets really interesting. This whole thing is connected to something called the Shai-Hulud worm, and apparently we're looking at the third coming of this threat. Some of the reporting suggests that attackers are actually using AI coding agents to help spread this worm and harvest developer secrets. I mean, that sounds almost like science fiction, but we're seeing more and more of these AI-assisted attacks. The name Shai-Hulud, by the way, is a reference to the giant sandworms from Dune, which is a pretty clever metaphor for a worm that burrows through developer environments and CI/CD pipelines. The bigger picture here is that this Bitwarden compromise is just one piece of a much larger campaign targeting Checkmarx. We're seeing headlines about something called Team PCP, compromising Checkmarx GitHub Actions using stolen CI credentials. And this apparently happened after some kind of breach on March 19th, 2026. Now, I want to be careful here because some of these details are coming from headlines and brief reports. But it sounds like we're dealing with a coordinated campaign where attackers gained access to CI/CD infrastructure and are using that access to inject malicious code into legitimate packages. That's exactly the kind of supply chain attack that keeps security teams up at night. What's really striking to me about this whole situation is how it demonstrates the interconnected nature of our development ecosystem. You've got Checkmarx, which provides security scanning tools, getting compromised. Then that compromise is being used to target other developer tools like Bitwarden CLI. And the attack method, poisoning GitHub Actions workflows, that's becoming a real pattern. GitHub Actions are incredibly powerful for automating builds and deployments, but they also represent a massive attack surface if you can compromise them. Once you control the build process, you can inject whatever you want into the final package. The good news is that Bitwarden's security team did identify and contain this malicious package, and they put out a statement about it. But here's what concerns me. This package was briefly distributed through the NPM delivery path, which means there was definitely a window where developers could have downloaded and installed the compromised version. And with something like a CLI tool, developers might not immediately notice malicious behavior, especially if it's designed to silently harvest credentials in the background. If you're using Bitwarden CLI, you definitely want to check which version you have installed and make sure you're not running 2026.4.0. From a technical perspective, what's really interesting here is the attack vector. Instead of trying to compromise Bitwarden's main infrastructure directly, the attackers went after the CI/CD pipeline. That's actually brilliant from an attacker's perspective because it lets you inject malicious code that gets signed and distributed through official channels. Users trust packages that come through the official NPM registry, especially when they're from reputable companies like Bitwarden. It's a classic example of why supply chain security is so challenging. You're only as secure as the weakest link in your entire build and distribution process. Looking at the broader implications, this attack highlights some serious issues with how we secure our development toolchains. GitHub Actions are incredibly convenient, but they also represent a single point of failure. If you can compromise the workflow that builds and publishes packages, you can basically backdoor anything. And when you're targeting tools like password managers and security scanners, you're not just compromising one application, you're potentially getting access to credentials and secrets that can be used for much larger attacks. My read is that we're going to see more of these CI/CD focused attacks because they're so effective. So, what should you do if you're a developer listening to this? First, obviously, check if you have Bitwarden CLI version 2026.4.0. installed and update if you do. But more broadly, this is a good reminder to be really careful about your CI/CD security. Use strong authentication for your GitHub Actions. Regularly audit your workflows and consider implementing additional verification steps for package publishing. And honestly, this whole incident is why I always recommend having multiple layers of credential management. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, even if that basket is as reputable as Bitwarden. The threat landscape is evolving, and supply chain attacks like this are becoming the new normal.